I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I'm especially thrilled to welcome you all to tonight's opening of our newest special exhibition, The Fight for Civil Rights in the South. I'd like to start this evening, as I always do, by giving a special warm welcome to our board members, our docents and volunteers, and our members who are here tonight. We could not do this sort of programming without all of you. If you are in one of those categories, wave your hand so you can brag. If you're not waving your hand, you need to get to the position to be able to do that. We desperately need volunteers to make sure that the students who come to this museum are having the best possible experience, and we need members to make sure that we can afford to do programming like this. So please stop by the membership table out in the lobby and get a flyer about volunteering and consider being a member. And that way you'll be on our mailing list and you'll hear about all of these incredible programs. I would also like to give a really big thank you to everyone supporting this exhibit, especially the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute for making this exhibition possible. Tonight, our presenting sponsors for this permanent exhibition, for this special exhibition, our presenting sponsor is Cinemark Theaters. I have a lot of names to read, so I'm going to ask you to hold your applause. We are also supported by Micon General Contractors and the Carl B. and Florence E. King Foundation. And our further exhibition sponsors are the City of Dallas, Office of Arts and Culture, Fossil Group, State Farm, African American Forum and Minority Men Affinity Network, Employee Resource Groups at State Farm, and Texas Instruments. Our hotel sponsor is Omni, Dallas Hotel, and we have some wonderful community sponsors, partners. The African American Museum of Dallas, Anti-Defamation League, Selma, Big Brothers Big Sisters of Greater Dallas, Congregation Anshe Torah, Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Denton Black Film Festival, Grant Halliburton Foundation, Legacy Senior Communities, Refugee Services of Texas, SMU Human Rights Program, Vickery Meadows Youth Development Foundation, Wings, and the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, please help me thank these incredible sponsors. Tonight, I'm pleased to share this exhibition with you, The Fight for Civil Rights in the South. It combines two incredible photographic exhibitions from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, Selma to Montgomery, photographs by Spider Martin, and Courage Under Fire, the 1961 burning of the Freedom Riders bus, with photography by Joseph Postiglione. Alongside these photos, you'll see original artifacts from our own collection and our partner institutions, the African American Museum of Dallas, Dallas Heritage Village, Dallas Public Library, and the University of North Texas Special Collections. I'm especially proud of our exhibition team here at the museum who took these two exhibits that were these wonderful photography and photographic images and brought them to life, supplementing them with film footage and with artifacts. I want to thank our team because they all have other full-time jobs, but they came together to make this a very special exhibition. So Dr. Sarah Abosh, Robin Amaba, Annie Plack, Spencer Cronin, Max Rosenzweig, Ryan Novak, and Felicia Williamson. And they were greatly assisted by our volunteer Nelson Weil. It's a dream team, so thank you guys. So before we begin the program, I would like to welcome Mark Zarate, CEO of Cinemark Theaters, our presenting sponsor of this special exhibition, and a new museum board member to say a few words.
Thank you, Mary Pat. It is really my privilege and honor to be here tonight representing Cinemark. As a partner of the museum, we at Cinemark are really truly committed to supporting local nonprofits who are changing our community for the better. We understand how a visit to this museum in particular can have life-changing effects, and we at Cinemark continue to do our part to bring the museum's mission to as many people as possible, especially children. This is why we're so pleased to be the presenting sponsor of this special exhibition that shows each person can make a difference, even during the most dark and divisive times in our country. Cinemark first became involved with the museum thanks to one of the Cinemark board members, Mr. Steve Rosenberg. His wife is with us tonight, Ruthie. I'm so glad you're here. Steve has always been a strong advocate of the museum, and a few years back at one of our board meetings, he introduced our founder, Mr. Leroy Mitchell. Many of you certainly know Leroy. He's a long-standing member resident of Dallas, to the mission of this museum. Well, Leroy is Leroy, and after he heard this word from Steve, Leroy started to think to himself, what can we do? And so the next thing you know, Leroy has come up with the idea of this state-of-the-art museum that you're now sitting in. He brought the proposal to the Cinemark board, and along with Steve Rosenberg, it was almost immediately approved, and lo and behold, about 18 months later, here's what we have, and we're very glad that you can be in it. We're so proud of this theater. We're so proud of how beautiful it is, and that so many people get to enjoy it and hear a wonderful message here. More than 24 companies came together to contribute in-kind equipment, services, materials, and expertise. And in fact, we have one of the most important ones here tonight whose belief in this project compelled them to get very involved in the project and support the museum and this important exhibition about the civil rights movement. Micon Construction was the general contractor of this museum's auditorium, so they were most responsible for actually supervising the day-to-day construction of it. They're here tonight with a special surprise, and I'd like to invite Mary Pat back up to the podium so that she could introduce the president of Micon and CEO, Mr. Charlie Myers.
I think you need to come over now. I want to thank Mark for inviting you and for you being here. It is so incredible to be in this theater and to experience the programming that we're able to do day in, day out. Your crew, I got to observe while we were building this museum. They were amazing. They really brought their heart and soul into building this theater for us, and we're so grateful. So thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mary Pat. When Cinemark approached us to show us the plans for this facility, building an auditorium in the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, we were thrilled. We were thrilled because by far this is the most significant culturally oriented project that we've done to date. And we wanted to be here to share this moment of history with the city of Dallas and our community. Corporate giving has always been a big part of Micon and its culture. We do it through our educational foundation, we do it through volunteership, and we do it through giving. So with that, I would like to present a check for $35,000. We'll sponsor their new special exhibit, the fight for civil rights in the South, and let it be, I guess, these type of exhibits are a reminder for our past and make sure that we don't make those mistakes in the future. So thank you very much.
When he got this job to come on and do this, he made it known
company didn't want to make a dime off it. So any money that they otherwise could have made, they donated back.
Charlie, again, thank you so much. MyCon was incredible to work with, and this is really icing on the cake. It was a wonderful surprise, and we're so thrilled that you're continuing to support us by supporting this exhibition. Companies like yours really bring about positive change in our community and make programs like this possible. And Mark, thank you for Cinemark's generosity and all you do personally to support the museum. Now to the panel discussion that you all came to hear. I would like to introduce our panelists. We are honored to have 4 esteemed speakers with us to discuss the civil rights movement with a focus on traditionally underexamined regions in the United States. As they make their way up to the stage, I will tell you a little bit about them. Dr. Stephen Bradley is professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies at Loyola Marymount University. Dr. Bradley's most recent books are Upending the Ivory Tower, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Ivy League, and Harlem versus Columbia University, Black Student Power in the Late 1960s. Dr. Jessica Clanderud is the director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education and an assistant professor of African and African American history at Berea College. She is currently working on a manuscript titled Struggle for the South, Civil Rights in Pittsburgh, From a Place to a Movement, a study of formal and informal power on the streets of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania during the Civil Rights Movement. And Dr. Quintard Taylor is the Scott and Dorothy Bullitt Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Washington. Dr. Taylor is the author of The Forging of a Black Community, Seattle's Central District from 1870 through the Civil Rights Era, and In Search of the Racial Frontier, African Americans in the American West, 1528 to 1990. And our moderator tonight is Dr. W. Marvin Delaney, a great friend of the museum. We consulted with Dr. Delaney to identify local artifacts for the display in the special exhibition, and he also advised us on the content of the slavery and African American history strands in our Pivot to America gallery. And he helped identify the civil rights upstanders that we highlight on our Texas Upstander wall. He was a great help. Dr. Delaney is Associate Professor of History Emeritus, former Interim Director of the Center for African American Studies, and the former Chair of the Department of History at the University of Texas, Arlington. He is currently working on a social and political history of African Americans in Dallas. At the conclusion of tonight's conversation, with time permitting, our panelists will take questions from the audience. So what we'd like for you to do is write your questions on a note card, and our staff will come by and pick them up, and we'll ask as many questions as we have. At this time, please silence your cell phones, and now I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Delaney.
Thank you, Ms. Matt. I appreciate that. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, welcome to the opening of the fight for civil rights in the South. We've got a very good panel that's going to discuss the civil rights movement nationally, as well as in the South and specific areas of this country. I'm going to just do sort of a short introduction. In fact, each of the panelists will do sort of a short introduction too, and then we'll open it up. I'll ask questions of them, and we're going to ask questions of each other in terms of our interpretation and our research and viewpoint on the civil rights movement in this country. Let me start with the sort of an introduction here. This exhibit is very, very special because it focuses on 2 incidents in the civil rights movement. It focuses on the Selma campaign in 1965, and of course the famous Selma to Montgomery March. It also focused on the Freedom Rise of 1961, when the Klan members, of course, as you saw in the exhibit, burned that bus outside of Anniston, Alabama. So it focuses on those 2 incidents in the civil rights movement, But as we know, the civil rights movement is much broader than those two incidents. So this is what you got in the exhibit. It's just a taste. But of course, I like what the museum staff, and particularly the exhibit staff, has done here by including some Dallas artifacts. If you ever get a chance, look at Dallas at the Crossroads. That's one of the artifacts from the African American Museum that we included in this particular exhibit, because indeed it was the publication done by the Dallas Citizens Council in 1961, trying to get the city ready for the desegregation of public schools here in the city. In addition, they were also trying to appeal to the goodness in the hearts of citizens in Dallas. That as they were saying to them, we don't want to be like Little Rock. I mean, if you remember Little Rock. We don't want to be like New Orleans. I mean, if you remember New Orleans. Basically, they were saying, be good citizens, be good Christians. Don't go out there screaming and hollering at little black children and spitting on them just because they're trying to integrate schools. Anyway, when I first came to Dallas, I'll share this story with you. When I first came to Dallas about 30 years ago, I was told that Dallas did not have, nor did it need, a civil rights movement. Dallas, yes. That Dallas was more Western than Southern. That Dallas was about cowboys and cattle ranching and so on, and oil, and not segregation and discrimination and, hateful signs of colored only and white only, like you saw in Mississippi and Alabama, and Louisiana, and North Carolina, and so on, and Georgia. Of course, that's a myth, right? Dallas did need the civil rights movement. In fact, although Jim Shusey, who of course is a local journalist, had written this book in 1987, sort of codifying this idea that Dallas didn't need a civil rights movement. In fact, that white businessmen in the city of Dallas had met with black leaders like A. Maceo Smith, E.C. Estelle, and Juanita Craft, and basically negotiated the pace and the things that were going to be changed in terms of housing, public facilities, the state fair, jobs, and of course desegregating the schools. And therefore there was no movement needed because the elites, the leaders in the city, literally had worked everything out. That's a myth. In any event, what we find, I want to turn this over to my good friend Bentar Taylor in a minute. What we find, however, because again I've spent a lot of time looking at the records and the stories about the civil rights movement here in the city of Dallas, we find that Dallas was very important in the civil rights movement. I'm going to give you just one example, because I actually could talk about this all day, but I want to share this forum and platform with my colleagues. In 1944, one of the most important cases in the civil rights movement occurred, not necessarily in Dallas, but the case started here in Dallas. It was a case called Smith versus Allwright, where the citizens, the black citizens of Texas, were trying to end the Democratic Party's white primary, which banned African Americans from voting in the city, or in the state's primary, as a matter of fact. And they had tried 3 times. They won the first 2 cases in the Supreme Court, lost the 3rd one, but finally, A. Maceo Smith, and of course, Thurgood Marshall, who was coming in and out of Dallas, pursuing this case, finally got a plaintiff out of Houston. They filed it in the federal court, and they won the case. It struck down the white primary, and it had a sort of reverberation effect across the South, because basically then in South Carolina, which was next, they were able to use the precedent here in Dallas and in Texas to strike down their white primary. Then it went to Florida, then it went to Georgia, and basically opened up the Democratic Party to all Americans, regardless of their race. And again, that case started right here in Dallas, and of course it's a part of what we historians call the long civil rights movement. That is, the civil rights movement didn't just start in 1954, all right, or in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. It starts way back. Some would say, one of my friends said, it started when the first African got off the boat. But I won't go that far. Anyway, I want to introduce you then to my colleague, Quintard Taylor.
Thank you. Is this mic on? Can y'all hear me? Thank you, Marvin. You touched on a number of important points, and some of which I want to try to build on as well. Dallas. Is Dallas the South or the West? Is Texas the South or the West? Certainly in terms of civil rights, the question is, did Dallas need a civil rights movement? I would say yes, because the entire West needed a civil rights movement. We tend to focus on, and rightly so, on what happened in the South. And certainly the exhibit outside reflects on that, reflects on Selma, reflects on other areas of Alabama and all. But there was a civil rights revolution that took place all over the country. I focus on the West, but there are other people, and you're going to hear some of them tonight, there are other people who focus on other areas of the country that reflect on this. I've said often that the civil rights movement was not simply a Southern affair, it was a national transformation. So did Dallas need a civil rights movement? Absolutely. Did San Francisco need a civil rights movement? Absolutely. Did Los Angeles need a civil rights movement? Absolutely. Seattle, Washington had literally thousands of people in the streets in the 1960s because of civil rights issues in that area of the country. So I don't think there's any corner of America that did not need and did not engage in a civil rights struggle of some form or shape. And we get back to the question of when the civil rights movement started. I gotta throw out something. Because I do the West, and because I start my history of the West with the first black people who came to the West, who came from central Mexico, I wanna give you an example. The example is Isabel de Alvera. She came to New Mexico. She was one of the first settlers in what would become New Mexico in 1600. Now, notice 1600 is actually, 19 years before 1619. And she got the officials in Mexico City to accept an affidavit from her. And I won't give you the entirety of the affidavit. But essentially, it said that she was free. She was the daughter of a Negro named Orlando, and an Indian woman named Magdalena, and she said she was going north and she feared that she would be molested. That's not her word, that's my word. But she would be bothered by people because of her race. And she said, I want to ensure that that wouldn't happen. And then she ended the affidavit with 3 words: I demand justice. I think that's the beginning of the civil rights movement in this country, and it was, as you can see, it began before we were the United States of America. And so, as Marvin said, as Marvin alluded to, this is a struggle that's long been around. The other thing I want to do, and I won't take 12 minutes to do this, the other thing I want to say is that the civil rights movement was really about ordinary people. Yes, we elevate Dr. Martin Luther King, and yes, we elevate the other civil rights leaders, as we need to, as we should. But I'll tell you, when it comes to the kinds of change that took place all over the country, that change was brought about by local people, by ordinary people, by local people right here in Dallas, local people across the South, including in my county, Haywood County, Tennessee. And there's no reason anybody in this room would know anything about Haywood County, except for the fact that Tina Turner's from there. But Haywood County in 1960 was a place where there was a black majority in the county. I was growing up in that county at that time. My mother and my father, who were in their 40s, had never voted in their lives. In other words, they were not allowed to exercise the basic right of citizenship. Essentially, a number of black sharecroppers, the poorest of the poor, decided that something had to be done. And so those sharecroppers went in and attempted to register the vote. They were rebuffed, and not only were they rebuffed, but there were economic reprisals. The landowners, the plantation owners who owned the land where the sharecroppers worked, kicked them all off. And as a result, the sharecroppers set up what would be known as tent cities on land that was owned by blacks and some sympathetic whites in Haywood County. And as a result, they would eventually welcome in
people from a young civil rights organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And SNCC people and these folks continued to work on voter registration until by November of 1960, and notice that's the time of the election, black people in Haywood County had the right to vote. But they had that right because of legislation that was passed at the national level, the Civil Rights Act of 1960. You can look it up. It was passed under the administration of Richard Nixon, of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Richard Nixon was vice president. And it set up the National Civil Rights Commission, which, by the way, is still in existence. At any rate, it's that kind of organizing on the part of these local people. This is long before most of those folks had ever heard of Martin Luther King. It's that kind of organizing by these local people that helped to bring about the change in Haywood County. And my mother and my father proudly voted for the first time in November of 1960. Now, I will say this, my father voted for the Democrats. My mother voted for the Republicans, but at least they voted, and they exercised their rights that should have been guaranteed, and in fact were guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. The one last point that I'll make very, very quickly is that we talk about the civil rights movement often in the past tense. We often talk about it as something that happened somewhere long ago. It happened in the 1960s or the 1970s. I hope if you don't remember anything else out of this discussion tonight, you remember that the civil rights movement is still going on. That there are still economic and political and social challenges and the weight of custom that still plagues African Americans and other people of color. And so we still got work to do. And I hope at the end of this conversation tonight, we will be able to talk about those kinds of things that are going on now and the kind of work that we, all of us in this room, need to do in order to advance that civil rights movement. It's not just history. It's not just ancient history. It is about all of us in this room right now.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on some of that as well. So you know from the introduction that most of my work focuses on Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And obviously that's not probably the first place most of you think of when you think about civil rights organizing. And one of the things that I think is really important when you look at how this expression of civil rights agitation looks like in places outside of the South is you're dealing with what I sometimes call a pernicious weed, the weed of custom. This isn't legal segregation. Pennsylvania had a law on the books about no segregation in public accommodations, so in your buses, your movie theaters, your streetcars, your restaurants, had been on the books since about the 1930s. So about 1939 is when that law was originally passed. But in the 1950s and 60s, people in Pittsburgh were still fighting to be able to go and eat a hamburger in a restaurant downtown, or to be able to go into a department store and try on a dress. These were the kind of fights that were happening, and it was just something that it's just not how we do things here. And so fighting against that custom is something that is really difficult to uncover, because you're considered rude, or you're considered, someone who just is, not doing things the proper way. And so much of this grassroots organizing that I'm talking about really came from people interacting with folks in their neighborhood and making friends with the lady down the corner and sharing bread when the bakery was having a sale on Thursday. This is the kind of ways that people worked around that custom and reformed that custom and made something new out of it. And one of my very favorite people to talk about, and it speaks directly to what Dr. Taylor was talking about in terms of, the kind of everydayness of this, is a woman named Alma Fox. And she was a fantastic, and actually remains, a fantastic Spitfire. She's about 5'2", small little lady, but just 100% fire all the time. Her nickname is Speed, if that gives you a clue on what she was doing. And I remember asking her, because someone was interested in where all the women were in the civil rights movement, because we see these men standing at the front of these lines, and asking asking where the women were, and she just looked at them and said, "Where do you think we were? We were making sandwiches." And she paused for a minute and said, "You don't think a march like that gets organized overnight? All those people got to get fed. All those people that are coming in from out of town need places to stay, and they can't stay at the hotel." So all of these women were opening their homes, they were opening their parlors, they were feeding way more people than what their budget was going to allow, but they stretched that food to the bitter end. And that was how these movements and organizing got started. It was in everybody's homes, on everybody's stoops, on everybody's street corner, sometimes talking politics, sometimes playing the dozens. All kinds of things were happening in the neighborhood. And these neighborhoods were not as segregated as we sometimes believe, but what they were was a place where Black people could develop their own society. In many parts of the Midwest and many parts of the North, housing segregation really kept people from being able to move out of their neighborhoods. And one of the things that I think that I find really interesting is, of course, voting rights and civil rights are really important, but in many parts of the Midwest and the North, the emphasis really was on human rights. It was, I need a job that pays a fair wage. I need housing that is safe and that is affordable for myself and my family. I need access to health care. I mean, these were the kinds of issues. So the things like from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that's on display in your museum, that's the kind of thing that organizers were really focusing on. It wasn't just political rights. It was the right to live, the right to have a just existence. And that fight especially continues because, of course, our laws do allow us to vote. They allow us to exercise our civil rights. But disenfranchisement is real. Redistricting is real. You know, all of these issues that prevent people from being able to fully exercise their rights as humans, those are the things that the kind of current movement is addressing. And I think that that's where we will continue to push forward in the future.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for being out here. The weather outside is frightful, but the mood in here is delightful. So I appreciate you all. You're my kind of people. Come out on a Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Look at this place. It's amazing. This building is amazing. You all are amazing. You all are doing more clapping in here than the Baptist Church on Sunday. So I appreciate it greatly. And I appreciate you letting me be up here on this stage with these scholars. May not mean a whole bunch to you all, but Quintard Taylor started a subgenre of history, Blacks in the West. And he's the foremost scholar of African Americans in the West, the foremost. And you can't go to any one of the conferences where I go and not hear about Brother Delaney. You cannot. And this young up-and-coming scholar, hard-charging scholar, all over the internets and ready to do her thing. It means the world for me to be here, and I'm so thankful. I ran into a brother in the exhibit, and he told me to always keep it 100. So in the spirit of that, I greet you the way that we greeted the world in 2014 in Ferguson. And the young people said, "Hands up, don't shoot." And then in the fall, they said, "If we don't get it, shut it down." And then in November, when the police officer who shot Michael Brown dead and allowed him to lay in the street for 4.5 hours was acquitted or not indicted, we said the whole damn system is guilty as hell. You see, I couldn't understand the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. I couldn't understand any of that until I tasted the tear gas, or until the smoke burned my eyes, or until we tried to outrun armored personnel vehicles, until I heard the helicopters thumping above us. I couldn't understand what I was writing about. I had read hundreds of books on the movement, pride myself on that, but I couldn't understand it until I tasted it. And so I'm thankful for what some of you all did in these years past. And so I write about a period, I research a period where young people were just crazy enough to believe that they could change the world. These young people said things like, do you remember when we stopped the war in Vietnam? Do you remember when we ran the Klan out? You see, they spoke in terms of we, not the French word, but we. And when I was on the streets in Ferguson, young people whom I teach regularly, somehow or another that word crept into their lexicon again, we. And so what Brother Taylor said about the civil rights movement is now, we call it the civil rights movement, we call it the Black Freedom Movement, some people call it whatever, the Black Liberation Movement. Yes, it's still happening. And so when I found out that there's going to be an exhibit released on fighting for civil rights in the South, I was like, that's dope, I'm with that. I assumed they meant the southern Canada border, is what they meant. That's what I thought they meant. Because if you thought that the evil, dirty, nasty racism was reserved for the South, then you'd be sorely mistaken. I write about the role of civil rights, black power in the Ivy League. We all up on the stage know of somebody by the name of John Hope Franklin, one of the premier historians in the nation. He talks about going to Harvard to take his PhD and sitting in class and his professors telling darky jokes. But listen, he had to make grades, though. He talks about not being served in Cambridge, he and his lady friend. At Harvard University, we talk about these institutions like they're the most liberal bastions ever created. At Harvard University, when a Mississippi alumnus found out that there's the potentiality of a black person living on campus, he said, well, I could fathom a time when black and white people eat together under the same roof. But, and I'm quoting, to sleep with a nigger is a horse of another color. This was the most liberal institution. At least black people could attend Harvard University. They couldn't even attend Princeton University until the 1940s. And it took World War II and the Navy to make it possible for African Americans to attend Princeton University. There, a black student remembers walking by one of the eating clubs, these private eating clubs, and having urine poured on them. Can you imagine going to your physics exam? I remind you that they had to make grades. And I only mention this because some people say, the students that you write about, Bradley, look, those are the privileged students. Sure, you're right. They're privileged. They're privileged. But I make this charge that black people, wherever they are, have to struggle for freedom, wherever they are. And so this is how it looked on campus. At Cornell University, black women who had established a co-op on campus because they had troubles living with white women in the dormitory, found a cross burning on their lawn in 1969. Can you imagine taking your literature exam or having to turn in your term paper and there was a cross burning on the lawn? This to me indicates that no, racism wasn't a Southern problem, but that it was an American problem. And these institutions that I write about, I say that they're the most American institutions in the nation. They had been around before there was actually a Constitution and a Declaration of Independence. I mention that because these young people, during this period of the Civil Rights Movement, saw what was happening in the South. Some went to the South, and they came back to their institutions, and they pushed back. At Columbia University, when the university attempted to expand into a public park and build a private gymnasium.
Stefan.
I'm coming off the mic. I'm coming off the mic. She never gave it to me.
No, I was going to interrupt you to actually ask you a question related to what you're talking about. But I need to pick at Brother Taylor real quick. I thought Tina Turner was from Nutbush, Tennessee.
In Haywood County. She moved to St. Louis.
Okay, make sure, very clear. All right, when you teach your students, or when you write about those students and the research you've been doing on, racism in the Ivy League, civil rights in the Ivy League, what is their understanding of civil rights in the South? What is their understanding of that history?
Yeah, no. Part of where I was headed with this is the idea that these students, many of the African American students had come from the South, where their parents were involved in the movement, where they participated themselves in the movement, and so one of the cases that I was talking about is the attempt of this university to build a gymnasium in a public park, a private gymnasium in a public park, and allow the public to use 2 floors of the 10 floors of the gymnasium, with the university students being able to use all 10 floors, but the public only being able to use 8 those 2 floors. And so they began referring to it as Jim Crow. Get it, GYM? That's a tough one.
Okay, let me go to Bill Tard. What would you say is the difference between the movement in the South and that in the West?
In the South, of course, in the South, there was obviously a whole host of issues, voting rights being the central one. In the West, voting right, well, let me qualify that. In Texas and Oklahoma, and I consider them part of the West. In Texas and Oklahoma, as you already referenced, there was a strong push for voting rights. From the Smith case in 1944 all the way down to how about 2018, when there were long lines of black people standing, waiting to vote in Houston and in Dallas and other precincts, because many of the voting facilities have been taken away from their neighborhoods. In other words, we come back to this, what Stefan said, what Jessica said, what we've all said, that this is not just ancient history, that the attempt to restrict black voting is going on right now. But to get back to your question, in the West, essentially there were 3 issues. Number one, there was job discrimination. Black people simply could not, now let me strike that. To a large extent, black people still cannot get jobs in the center of the economy. That's a reality, and that's a reality in Dallas. It was a reality in San Francisco. It was reality, sadly, even in Seattle. There was no, as Stefan said, it's the south of the border, south of the Canadian border. So job restrictions, job discrimination, that was legion all over the West in the 1960s, and in some cases it extends right to this day. The other issue was housing discrimination. And housing discrimination gets to be very, very tricky in the North and in the West, in the sense that there often is no formal segregation as there was in the South, no formal laws codifying segregation, but there's custom. And that custom can be summed up in redlining. It can be summed up in restrictive covenants. It can be summed up in, if you will, agreements between the city and individual homeowners to restrict the people who are living in certain areas. All of this resulted in black communities, segregated black communities, even in places like Oakland and San Francisco and Seattle and Portland and Denver and on and on and on and on. Indeed, the only places in the West that didn't have segregated communities were those places which essentially didn't have any black people. There was an absence of a black population. The third issue, and I'll do this very, very quickly, the third issue, and this in some ways comes out of the second issue, and in many ways we're dealing with it right now, segregation, school segregation. Black people in the 1960s went to segregated schools. The segregated schools were inferior. This is not Mississippi, this is not Alabama, this is the state of Washington, this is the state of Oregon, this is the state of Colorado. As a matter of fact, one of the first major pieces of civil rights legislation involving school desegregation came, well, actually the first piece came out of Topeka, Kansas. Remember, it's Topeka Board of Education, Brown v. Topeka Board of Education. Topeka's not in the South. But the second major civil rights victory in the Supreme Court came in 1973 in Denver when the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the desegregation of schools in Denver. Well, guess what? The Supreme Court ordered the desegregation of schools in Denver. They are more segregated today than they were in 1973. That's what I mean by the continuation of the civil rights movement. So those are the big issues. Those are the big issues in the West. So again, as everybody in this panel stated, there's no area of the country that is free of this kind of practice.
Jessica, you did oral history stuff for your research. What kind of issues did your interviewees in Pittsburgh discuss in terms of civil rights? Was it housing? Was it voting discrimination? Was it facilities? And indeed, how did it differ from what had been done in the South?
I'm going to take your question and twist it a little, as I want to do. So one of the things that I was talking to my interviewees about was what they remember about their neighborhood when they were children. Because those are the memories that stick with us, that feeling of walking home from school and you skirt this street because you know that there is a gang of young white boys that live on this street, and if you go down this street you're going to get a beating on the way home from school, but if you go one block over, that's the safe route to go home to get to your house. And so that was the kind of question that I was asking them about. And so one of the things, because we do this sometimes as historians where you go in with a bit of an idea of what you expect to hear, and then people you're interviewing blow that all up and you end up having to start over from scratch. And so one of the things that I was looking at in the Hill District was this process of urban renewal. Now, urban renewal happened all over the nation, all kinds of places. We've been in discussion about how it seems like somebody got a playbook out of Washington, except it didn't happen that way. Every city kind of came up with their own version of urban renewal. But I had this idea that when the neighborhood changed was probably during urban renewal, because in Pittsburgh, they plopped a stadium right down in the middle of the historic Black district, cut the Black business district in half, drove the population out. They didn't know where about 7,000 people went, just all kinds of variations on that theme. And so I was saying, oh, it's probably urban renewal that messed this all up. And they said, no, it wasn't urban renewal, it was the riots. And I had to kind of go, wait, what? The riots? I mean, of course I knew. After Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there were a series of disorders, as the city called them, in Pittsburgh. And I asked, well, what changed after the riots? And they said, we used to be able to live our entire life in our community. We had grocery stores, we had our barber shop, we had our clothing stores and our shoe stores. We knew all of our, people. Now, interestingly enough, the Hill District was never 100% African American. There actually was a really large Jewish population. There were a bunch of Syrians that lived there. There were just, a bunch of immigrants, but they tended to be the newer stock of immigrants that were coming in the 30s and 40s. And so what changed after that is people got scared. And so they closed their shops, they left the area, they moved into other parts of the city, because if you could achieve anything close to whiteness, you were granted access to all kinds of emerging suburbs and things. And so what happened to the neighborhood was this definition that their streets were violent, that their streets were scary, that they would not be protected if they were there anymore. And so that is what sort of changed the character of the neighborhood for the people that was interviewing. So for them, it wasn't so much about, voting rights. It turned into a food desert. About 4 years ago, they finally got a grocery store back in the Hill District. And they had been trying for about 15 years. And so that's the kind of issue that becomes that sort of everyday right, that everyday right to live. Do I have the right to live as a human in my city, or do I have to be kind of relegated to the second-class status by someone else outside?
In your research, Stefan, well, let me just sort of set this up. One of the things I constantly heard in my final years of teaching was that the Civil Rights Movement hurt African Americans more than it helped. And I had young people also telling me that things were worse now than they ever been. Did you get that argument before? And have you gotten some of that argument from the students that you've been teaching?
I've heard some of this foolishness. And there was a quick little thing going around where there were T-shirts where people would wear a T-shirt saying, "This is not your grandparents' movement," and this kind of thing, insinuating that somehow or another these kids are tougher than the people who came before them. I was like, I don't know who your grandparents were. Mine were lit. Like, yeah. And so I think there's kind of a myth that goes along with this. One of the things that they're speaking to, which is something a little bit closer to home, is the idea that when people sought integration, what was the prize was the resources. It wasn't necessarily that black people wanted so much to go to school with white people or to work with or eat with white people. It was the resources that people desired. The pushback against integration, scholars like Derek Bell talked about the idea that perhaps we made a tactical error. Instead of pushing for integration through the court system, perhaps we should have made the courts enforce separate but equal, and made each one of these little tiny towns buy a completely new school, buy a completely new bus, and live up to that in those ways. But no, if you ask people who have managed to live through the civil rights and Black Power movement and anti-apartheid, if things are better now than they were then, they would say yes. Now they would caveat and say we are in deep danger at this point. And that was one of the things that I saw on the street is grandmothers crying literally because they said, "I thought we were done with this." And so,
Yes, you can.
I agree with Stefan, but I have a slightly different take. I think in some ways, the generation of the 1960s, my generation, oversold not so much the civil rights movement, but oversold their success in the movement. And so my kids, had to listen to all the things that my generation did, all the accomplishments that we made. And I think there was, kind of rightly so, some pushback to that. There was the assumption that, people who were involved in the 1960s were superhuman. They were not. They were ordinary people, as I said before. They won some victories, they lost some victories. I also think that in some ways we did some over-promising in terms of the civil rights movement. And what I mean by that is that we assume, and this goes back to the points that both of you made, we assume that if you got an integrated school, everything would be fine. If you got employment or, you got corporate elites, black corporate elites, everything would be fine. If black people got into Harvard, regardless of what happened to them when they were in Harvard, if black people got into Harvard, everything would be fine. And so I think there was some naivete on the part of our generation, and that naivete got translated into a kind of myth that somehow or another we were extremely powerful and that we had changed America. I think you referenced it earlier, or somebody referenced the fact that, we were the generation that changed everything. Well, maybe we didn't. Maybe we didn't change everything. And I think in some ways the kids of today are picking up on that, and they're saying, we need to continue what you started. We respect what you do. Well, sometimes they respect what the older generation did, but we also understand that struggle is not over.
I have a question. So to me, I think at the crux of much of this is housing. It seems to me that that's like when we're talking about the failure of there's the legislation, you can have a Fair Housing Act and that sort of thing, but as Malcolm said way back, any black person who moves into a white person is living in a black neighborhood, because if it gets to be more than about 10% black, white people move out. And so housing is, to me, one of those most important things. And so this urban renewal, what some people call Negro removal, like, I don't think that was a small thing. And so that housing, jobs, education and health are all indicators of good lives. And I'm sure those things were undermined by racism. So I wonder.
Go ahead.
I'm going to jump in, sorry. One of the things that I talk about, because I think it's really important, is where a lot of the violence happens here is when social integration kicks in. Because if you're worried, and which is really the root of a lot of this worry, that your daughter is going to start dating a black man, that's where people got violent. I mean, that is where the risk was. So they were deeply concerned in Pennsylvania about dance halls, about roller skating rinks, swimming pools, because of course you can't see someone in less than a full suit of clothes. That's dangerous automatically. And so there's, a lot of the way that they talk about these risks of integration, it's about intimacy and, those social relationships that cause us to care about someone who's different than us. And so I think that's really kind of an underdeveloped piece of this anxiety, because housing, of course, we spend a lot of our lives in our homes. And so that kind of intimacy of social relations is where a lot of the risk comes from.
Okay.
Can I add something? We're trying to move the conversation along, but then,
open it up to the audience.
Okay, and that's appropriate. One other word that we have to throw into the mix is gentrification. Gentrification changes everything. In the 1960s, well, I'll tell this story. It'll be a short story. In the 1970s, I just started teaching.
Well, we'll cut you off if it's
Okay. In the 1970s, I started teaching, and I was doing research, and I talked to this elderly black woman who, ironically, is about my age now, or I'm her age now. And I talked to her about the neighborhood, the black community in Seattle. And I said to her, what do you think is the future of the neighborhood? And she said, eventually whites will move back in, they will gentrify it, everything will be different, black people will have to move out. And I said to myself, this woman's been smoking something. and as fate would have it, she actually proved to be correct. And so the big challenge in terms of housing is not just the food deserts, not just getting access to good housing, it's whether or not black people can keep the traditional communities they had. Can you guys say Deep Ellum? In other words, what we see happening right here in Dallas is happening in community after community after community across the country. We have a situation in Seattle where the vast majority of black people in the metropolitan area of Seattle live in the suburbs. Now you might say, wow, that's amazing progress. That's what we all wanted in the 1960s. The reality is that black people have been forced to those suburbs because the city of Seattle is so expensive to live that black people can't afford to live there. So in a sense, they have been pushed out of the central cities, and those central cities have become kind of like the European cities.
Okay. All right. We're going to break right now to take questions from the audience. If you got a piece of paper when you came in, then we'll pick it up and I will read it for the panel. first question is, as an ordinary white person, what can I do to help?
Have a real black friend. By which I mean someone who you know something about their life, not someone that you just work with. It's really important, and it is more difficult, I think, than we sometimes realize, because it's easy to not see someone else's struggle when you don't have any relationship with someone who suffers from that. And honestly, that can apply to things like have a friend with disabilities, because especially invisible disabilities, you don't see what it's like to walk through the world in their shoes unless you have a relationship with people who are dealing with that.
I would say, and this is, I think, one of the toughest things in the world to do for my good white brothers and sisters is I dare you to challenge Uncle Joe at the dinner table and Auntie Jane. I dare you to do it. I don't like to fuss with my folks at the dinner table, but I dare you to do it. If you really care about progress, advancement, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I dare you to challenge Uncle Joe and get to the root of the issue. That's much harder to do. It's easy for people to show up on the street or to buy the How to Be an Anti-Racist book and that sort of thing. That's an easier thing to do than to actually confront the people who happen to propagate a certain kind of racism. As I mentioned, I'm out in LA now. My fear is not that the Crips or the Bloods will get me. That's not it. My fear is that I live walking distance from my school. My fear is that my 6'2" self will somehow 150 pounds of thunder, by the way. But listen, I'm trying to tell that my fear, no, I have a serious fear, and I joke a little bit, but my fear is this: I don't take out my trash after 9 o'clock. And I try not to walk in the dark time through my own neighborhood for fear that these people who rail about Donald Trump will call the law on me, and I'll be forced into a situation in front of my own house.
Can I add that, since I asked on that question before? And this, I will say up front, this will be shameless self-promotion. You guys know about I don't know how many of you know about our website, blackpast.org. It's a 6,000-page website, on and on and on. It's the biggest website on African American and global African history on the internet today, blah, 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 okay? Here's what I suggest to you, and this is serious. Go to sources like that. Go to other sources. Learn about black people. And when I say this, I mean for black people too. Learn about your history. Learn, because you can't really understand other people and other people's situation until you begin to truly learn about it. And you can confront Uncle Willie and whatever, and that's good. I'm not knocking that. But at the same time, take some time to go to places, go to sources where you can learn that information. Because I think all too long we have said, well, we want to be holistic, we want to be inclusive, we want to bring everybody in, and accept that the dominant narrative is essentially about one group of people. How do you bring everybody in if we don't know about the other people that we want to bring in? And so it's up to us, and this is everybody in this room, it's up to us to learn about those other people. I have to do the same thing for Latinos. I have to do the same thing for people who are gay. I have to do the same thing. I have to learn about other folks in order to be a whole person myself, in order to be able to speak to the question of inclusion for everyone.
I'm going to go ahead to the next question. What do you think about the absence of an official policy for the institution and legacy of slavery by the United States government?
Oh, you want me to start? The absence of an official policy, at what point was, huh?
Apology.
Oh, apology,
Yeah.
okay, apology. I think it's the United States government, the United States government, especially this government, doesn't apologize for anything. The question is, and this is me speaking, I'm not representing anybody else on the panel or anybody else in the civil rights community. The question is, how do you move forward without an apology? If you wait for an apology, nothing's gonna happen. What you have to do is take your freedom, okay? That's it. You don't wait for other people to say, I'm sorry for what I did to you. It would be nice. It would be, it would show contrition on their part, but you can't wait for progress until they make the apology.
And you could give reparations.
In fact, I'm going to the next question related to that. It says, how should we talk about reparations as a country? If it happens, what will it change?
Part of what makes America America is the ability to own. The people who own happen to be the freest people in the nation. The inability to own is what's rooted in this racism, this anti-black racism that has occurred in this country. If you think that slavery was too long ago to give reparations for, then you can just think about my mama in Port Gibson, Mississippi, who couldn't go to the library.
Yep.
She deserves reparations for that. Her mama paid for the library.
Yep.
So in my mind, it could be in the form of money. It could be in the form of tax-free living for the next 30 years. I don't care how you do it, but somebody is owed something. And if that makes me a weirdo or a beggar, then call me what you will. But an apology is just the babyest step.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to go to the next question. I want to get in as many as I can. What social norms and cultural biases do we need to be more aware of? How can we positively affect change for civil rights and, of course, for everyone?
Okay, I'm gonna say it.
In fact, Jennifer, Jessica, I thought you sort of alluded to that actually earlier. So.
Yeah, social norms. First of all, no one should be penalized for wearing their natural hair. The fact that there are laws in 3 or 4 states coming through right now to make it so that people cannot discriminate against people for wearing their natural hair. Really? And secondly, no, you may not touch it. I have 2 young ones, and I can't tell you how much just every day I am policing how people come up to my children. And that's just a social norm. You would not do that to someone who you weren't already putting in a position as other and accessible to you. Don't do it. No. Don't kiss the babies. It's RSV season. Please keep your germs to yourself. These are some things that, I think people just assume access to other people that is not appropriate. And especially when that person is a Black person, it somehow doesn't seem as important to you to maintain those boundaries that you would otherwise maintain. And that's just something that we don't talk about much, but I think is really, really detrimental. I mean, I'm just going to share a little bit. My daughter is 7 years old, and she right now is scared to wear a dress, and has been for a couple of years, because one Sunday after church, she was looking super cute, and this lady just came up to her when we were out for dinner after service and just would not let it go. Was just up in her space, was telling her how cute she was, and it seriously freaked my daughter out. And still, now she's just like, I think I would just rather not. I would rather not wear a dress. And I'm like, okay, baby, I'm gonna let you do what you want to do, but I want you to know that you're safe.
Okay, let me give you an easy question here. All can weigh in on this. If I were to go out and purchase a book that details civil rights in the South, what would you suggest and why? I'm going to say the Taylor Branch series. Okay, it's a good one to start with.
I would say start by reading Margaret's work on Dallas. I mean, you all live in Dallas. Start with the local history. Understand why there was a civil rights movement here in this city and across Texas and across the nation.
That it's not a book, by the way. It's an essay that's in a book. It's called Whatever Happened to the Civil Rights Movement in Dallas, Texas. It's a book that I edited with a colleague called the American Civil Rights Movement. Essays on the American Civil Rights Movement.
Still read the book.
Asking me to pick one book is like asking me to choose my one best friend. No, it's not happening. One I really actually like for a really general audience, and I saw it in the exhibit, is John Lewis's graphic novel series called March. It's really accessible, good for all kinds of ages, and I think does a good job of dealing with his particular story, but that's definitely worth a look.
Yeah, this is impossible, and so, yeah, I would say there is a book called The Foot Soldiers of Democracy, which is oral histories of people young people, part of the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama. These were young people who went out and marched, and the dogs were sicked on them. I think that'd be a way of understanding just how invasive this racism was.
Well, again, y'all dodged the question, so sort of, but I'll accept this. Again, the Taylor Branch series, basically called America the King Years, and it's with 3 volumes to it. So again, it's a good place to start. So.
You can buy my book. Look, you can buy my book. It's not on the South, but it's take Social Security checks.
And my book's coming, so.
Okay. Next question. Where does local government and law enforcement fit into the contemporary civil rights movement? Steph, I know you want to take on that.
Well, I mean, that's always been. Well, so I think. Let me say this. I think police get a bad rap because police are asked to be so many things. Police are asked to come break up our dispute between us. Police are asked to turn down the music, all these different things. But police do act on behalf of the government. And this is an important aspect of why Ferguson went the way it did. If the only time I see police, because they don't live in the neighborhood, they live 2 counties over, if the only time I see them is when they're snatching a body from my neighborhood, live or dead, from my neighborhood, then it's going to be difficult for me to respect them in the way that people think we ought to respect authority. At the same time, if I live 2 counties over in an all-white county, but I come to police in an all-black area, then psychologically, I'm always looking for somebody to do something wrong. And so the police element is no small thing. I would also say, though, that teachers at the elementary level is no small thing. That is where you find the fewest number of African American, particularly males, in that space. And so when young people grow up and they envision authority, they envision it in a kind of way, and it's an early training. So.
Anyone else?
Well, I would just add a footnote to that. It's hard to answer that question because there's been this conflict. There's been this conflict between police and the African American community going back to slavery. And the first patrols, the police forces in the South evolved out of slave patrols. And so they were always seen not to protect and serve, but to control a population that they deemed as hostile. And those kinds of attitudes extended well into the future, extended into the 20th century. One of the most bizarre situations that happened in Seattle, and I know Seattle because of my own work there, was when the huge black community moved there in the World War II period. The first thing the city fathers did was decide to recruit white policemen from the South because these white policemen knew how to control black folks. That's the wrong thing to do. That's the wrong approach. And it sort of intensifies, as we've said, it intensifies this kind of conflict between police and black communities. How do you resolve this? I think one of the ways to resolve it is to put more police of color on it, although sometimes police of color can exacerbate the situation. But to certainly put people of color into leadership positions is the first step toward trying to deal with this.
Just real quick, and for local government, get involved. Y'all ever been to your local city council meeting?
Yeah.
There's like 12 people there sometimes. Like, make sure that you come out and make sure your voice is heard.
And to remember that civilians run the police force, like civilians are supposed to run the military.
Right.
Like, that's the way this Constitution thing designed it, I thought.
Well, anyway, we'll go to the next question. This one's obviously very relevant in terms of our political times. And the question says, how can we get poor whites with people of color to find common cause on economics? We got a long way from civil rights, I think, but
No, okay.
it's related, I guess.
Look, it's actually streaming right now. PBS just had a documentary on the First Rainbow Coalition in Chicago. Coalition politics work. They are hard, but that is a great direction to go. And the organization in Chicago, combination of Black Power folks, the Young Lords, Young Patriots, which was a primarily white Southern and Appalachian organization, American Indian movement, just all kinds of folks were involved in this. And so it can work, but it is challenging to do, but that's, I think, one of the only ways forward that we're going to be able to go.
And historically, hasn't that been the thing? That people who were not poor have been able to create a wedge between these people who would otherwise have much in common based on it?
There's a great book called Why the U.S. Never Had a Socialist Revolution. And the key point, the key takeaway from that book is because of racial division. And we can argue that that racial division goes back to colonial America. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but it goes back to Bacon's Rebellion and the fact that political elites in Virginia, recognizing 1 century before the American Revolution, that blacks and whites and poor whites were getting together and they were attempting a revolution to overthrow the colonial government. Those elites decided that race would be the dividing line, and that would ensure that there would be no unity between these groups. We live with the consequences of that. Can I say Donald Trump? Yeah. There is a straight line from Bacon's Rebellion, the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion in 1675, all the way up to today.
I just want to add to that because I think we all hopefully know that race is a social construct. It doesn't have any meaning, but it has some effect. But what I want to point out is race is doing work. It is doing real work of keeping people from recognizing their common cause. Look, we all have more in common, no matter how much any of us make, than we do with a billionaire. This is just a reality. And so the work that race is doing is making that dividing line seem really strong when it's not as much.
Okay, this is the last question. What do you hope to see as the results of the civil rights movement? We're talking, on the civil rights question, then in terms of what should the results be of the movement that's been going on for so long?
A free and fair and equitable America.
Yeah.
And we're a long way from that right now. And the question is, how do we get to it? That's the challenge for the civil rights movement, quote unquote, and those who support the civil rights movement right now.
I would say I would like to see America be who it says it is on paper.
I think for me, I'd like to see a situation that works in favor of the customer as right. We're paying for a lot of things, including schools and firefighters and police. I'd like to see those things work for everybody who's paying for them. And I think that that's a tough way to go, But if they don't bring your nachos out right at the restaurant, we say send these back because they're not good. We have to be able to do that with politicians. We have to be able to do that with administrators. We have to be able to do that with everybody. And I want everybody to feel empowered in that way, to lay claim to the things that we paid for. Sometimes we
I want to thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. It's such an important conversation. There were several things that really resonated with me. Dr. Taylor, first thing you said was that the civil rights leaders were just ordinary people. And we hope in our museum to make people think about their responsibility to be upstanders, to stand up to unfairness and injustice and inequality. And hopefully the students that come through our museum will think about their responsibility to get engaged and be the ordinary people that make a difference in the future. And our Pivot to America gallery is based on the construct of American ideals, American reality, American repair. The reality is our ideals have not applied to all of our citizens, but thank goodness there are upstanders who have worked to make them at least move us in the right direction. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for coming. If you haven't visited the permanent exhibition, come back and go see it. And please join us again for our upcoming programs.